apologies for being late. It was just technical problems that was just a little bit unfortunate. So let me apologize to everybody who's joined. So I'm absolutely thrilled today to be joined by Badar Khan. I was actually trying to work out when I first met him, but I think it must be, God, it must be over 15 years ago. It's a very long time.
I think it
I
is.
think it was when you were with British Gas Services, was it?
Yeah, British Gas Business. That was in, yeah, that was probably around 2007 or eight,
Well,
around that time frame.
it's been some long time, that I do know. And I'm so thrilled that you joined today to share with people some of your thinking about being a CEO, about leadership. You are somebody who I would rate in the top three of the best leaders that I know. So I'm very, very thrilled and very honored that you said that you're going to join us today. So I'm not going to do too much talking. This is going to be mainly on you, Badar. So let me ask you the very first question, just to please tell everybody a little bit about you. Um, Basically, how you got to where you are today. And I know you're just about to start another exciting role as well, but how you got there, what's your journey? And I think, when did you first begin to recognize how important leadership could actually be in your life? So over to you, Badar.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for having me, Penny. It's a pleasure to be here. Um, it's great to see you too. I don't think I had any real idea of what leadership was or is. When I started working, I had assumed, maybe like others, that leadership is all about is about being smart. And so the smarter you are, the better a leader you are. One of my first jobs out of university was in consulting, in management consulting, where it's all about it can be about how smart you are, and that's often what you're selling to clients. And I was there for about 4 years, 3 years in London, a year in Boston. And I got to the point where I was coming up with buzzwords so that I could sound smarter. I didn't know what I was talking about. I probably lived in fear that I was going to get discovered because these buzzwords weren't really real. Um, but there were I would say there were two experiences that I had earlier in my career that helped me understand that leadership wasn't just about being smart. Smart can be helpful. There's a certain level of intelligence I think that's important, but it's certainly not what leadership is about. The first was actually at a startup after business school. So I was in consulting, went to business school, and this startup was about 20 to 25 years ago. Like a lot of startups, we ran out of money, and we had to lay off a lot of people. And I was an officer of the company, and all of a sudden, people were looking to me, and I realized that being smart actually wasn't helping. It wasn't helping me do what needed to be done at the time. And they were looking for something, and I didn't know really what I had to offer or what they needed. I think that's the first time I realized that leadership isn't about me, but it's about the people that I lead or serve. At that same time, I met my wife. My wife is she's smarter than me. There's no doubt about that. But more importantly, she has this amazing ability to relate to people and engage with people. When she listens, it's almost as though she's feeling what other people are feeling. She's incredibly open about herself and her feelings, and I think that allows people to reciprocate. So, I had this work challenge going on that was challenging, and I didn't really know how to respond. And personally, I was meeting somebody who was opening me up to this idea that there's a whole way of engaging with people, and a glimpse into what leadership actually might be. That was the first time I think I appreciated something about what leadership might be that's beyond just being smart and clever. Second time was about 5 years later. I moved on from the startup, and I joined this sort of large energy company, Centrica, and I was in the U.S. part of the company, and In fact, I was sent over to the UK to run a division of British Gas, which is where we met Penny, a British Gas business.
Yeah.
And at the time, British Gas business had an open plan office, right? So I was getting promoted this was in my late 20s or early 30s. I was getting promoted and I was moved into an office. And at British Gas business, there were no offices. Everyone sat out on the floor. It was open plan. And I was the managing director of this business. I had a couple of thousand people. And all of a sudden I could see that everybody, I'd come into work and people were looking at me. And I couldn't hide in an office, which is what maybe what people used to do. And I think that was the time that I also realized that my behaviors, my actions, the words I used, what I did, all of these things matter because people are looking at you. Um, and I realized that leadership was actually largely about there's sort of things about your character and your skill set, but a lot of leadership is about behaviors, how you conduct yourself, your actions and your words. And that was the first time that I went on a program with you, Penny, one of umpteen different programs I've been on over the last 16 or 17 years. I went on to increasingly bigger leadership roles. My last role was leading a team of men and women, 17,000 men and women at National Grid in the US, providing electricity, gas, and clean energy solutions to folks in the Northeast. I've had the privilege of leading leaders over the last 5 or 10 years who've gone on to become CEOs of their companies, and I'm super thrilled and excited about that.
Badar, it is fascinating. What I love, and it's the first time I've heard this from anybody, that it was when they met their wife or when they met their partner that
Yeah.
they really began to understand leadership from them. I mean, what a wonderful, wonderful credit to Masu that she knows that she began to inspire you on that journey.
Yeah.
It's the only time I've ever heard that. And I think it's absolutely fabulous. How lucky you are to have a partner who really understands leadership. I think for some of us, we might consider that's a tiny bit rare. So I think that's wonderful. So, Badar, just tell me, one of the things that you hear really often is how lonely it can be being a CEO. Tell me what your thoughts are about that. And if you do feel that that can be the case, how you actually choose to deal with it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it can be lonely. There are aspects of leadership that can be tough. You're making some tough decisions. Um, Actually, and some of the toughness is not necessarily what I think a lot of people think about CEOs. It's tough to be a CEO because there's so many pressures of the market or investors or competition or what have you. And all those things I think are true. But actually, I think it's also tough to be the leader of an organization because you're making decisions that are not they're not easy. Uh, and what I mean by that is it's a little like being a parent. When you're a parent, and I'm not trying to say that all parents are, or you have to be a parent to be a good leader, but to be a parent, you have to let go. Your kids have to kind of figure things out for themselves. You can't sit their exams for them. You can't go to college. My daughter's going to college this weekend. I can't do that for her. I have to let go, and she has to figure some things out for herself. It's important that I'm there for her. I'm cheering her on. I'm supporting her. I'm there to catch her if she falls, but I'm not doing her exams and I'm not going to college for her. So you kind of have to let go. And there's an aspect of being a CEO or being a leader that does require you to do that with your people. And if you're someone that cares about you, I care about my daughter. If you're someone that cares about your people, that's not easy to do. I would say that you have to do a lot of listening. A lot of people think about CEOs sort of commanding the room and doing all the talking, and that's quite the opposite. I think as a leader, you're listening more than you are talking. I think you have to be able to have a level of self-awareness that is incredibly important. When you're rising through an organization, People will sit down with you, and at the end of the year, you'll do a performance review, and someone will say, "Here's what you did well, and here's what you didn't do well." And that's great because you learn insights that are important. Um, but when you're the CEO, there's nobody above you. There's no one that's going to sit down with you and say, "Here's how you did, and here's some feedback." And so, actually, it's incredibly important that you develop the ability to get to have self awareness and to seek out that feedback because it's not going to come easily. People below you are not, they're not as likely to give you feedback as people above you. And so, that kind of requires you. I talk about this sometimes to operate in two different dimensions. You're operating in your dimension, so in your reality, where you're present, you're real, you're authentic. You're who you're bringing your full self to the present. But you also kind of have to lift yourself up and watch what you're doing to ensure that your impact, how you're landing with people, is what you in fact intended. And that is so you're watching yourself at the same time. It's kind of like holding a mirror up to yourself that you're doing for yourself. And I don't think that's easy to do, but it's incredibly important to do.
Yeah, I mean, it is. And I think self-awareness, as you know, one of the things that we always invariably find when we deliver the 3-day program is quite often on that first day when we get people to introduce themselves, and then when we measure communicating behavior, you can see the almost shock at, that's not how I thought I was being. That's not how I thought I was behaving. And you will have seen it time and again the times you've been through the program. And it's not that people don't care. I think it is that, do people actually work hard enough at getting feedback about how other people view them,
Yeah.
even if it's not how you view them, you
Okay.
view yourself, and then having the courage to accept it without immediately going defensive, because it's just not how you see yourself. It is really interesting. And I imagine, again, in those circumstances, you probably get some good feedback from your lovely lady.
I do. But I'll give you another example about this self-awareness. I had my nephew, this is years ago, he was 16 years old, I think about 16. He came in and work shadowed with me. We were in the States. We were actually in Houston at the time. And he came over and did kind of sat in my meetings for a week. Um,
Yeah.
and it was all great. And at the end of the week, I asked him, "So, how did it go?" And he said, "Well, I mean, he's a 16-year-old, he's very bright, but he said, well, people were using a lot of jargon, a lot of words. I didn't understand what they were talking about." I said, "I know that's a hazard in these professional environments." And he said, "So I tuned them all out." And I was like, "Okay, well, so what happened then?" He said, "Because I couldn't understand them all, so I tuned it all out." He said, "Instead, I just watched the body language of the people in the meeting," because he could do that. And he said that I could tell whether someone was having a good meeting or a bad meeting just based on their body language. And I think that is, when you talked about self awareness, I think that's an example of a leader needing to be able to pick up on all of these cues, verbal and nonverbal, and ensure that, when you're in a meet, when someone comes in and has a meeting with you, you don't want them to leave feeling crap about themselves and feeling battered or bruised. You want them to leave feeling more confident. They may leave the meeting with a different direction or a different idea, which is totally fine. But you want it to be their idea. You want them to feel like it's their idea, and you want them to feel that it was something that they came up with, and they came away more confident and not less confident. And my nephew was saying, I could see that from body language.
Yeah, interesting. Sometimes maybe we use too many words that aren't necessary, you
Yes.
know.
Yeah, indeed.
But one of the things that you've got a heck of a reputation for, and I have to say it's interesting, there's a couple of comments been coming up. Somebody said here, Brian, so great to hear from Badar, truly one of the best leaders I've worked under.
It's nice.
So that's it doesn't surprise me in the least. But that leads me towards asking you, one of the things that you have got a reputation for is how incredibly well, you build a team. And you're now going in to be shortly starting with building a new team, which is also going to be quite challenging because it's mainly virtual. But tell me, what is it that you think that you do? What are some of the behaviors that you think that you really bring alive that help you build a team? Because it's not just about building for performance, it's building in a way that trust goes both ways. They trust you and you trust them. How do you go about that?
Yeah. So, well, thank you to Brian for that comment, first of all. I mean, I think it does start in an environment, with a team. It starts with listening. So as a leader, it's important to listen. Two ears, one mouth. That ratio is important. And you're not listening to rebut. You're not listening to try and to sort of come up with your argument for something that's different from what you're hearing. You're not listening to figure out when you can get your word in. You're listening to genuinely listen to what is being said. I think when you are talking, it's important to start. It's important to be to focus on the positive. I guess I'll go back to the parenthood example. If you're, this is a story you used to tell, Penny. If you're watching a soccer match where your kid's playing a game and they didn't have the best game, and you're in the car journey home, what are you going to do? Are you going to talk about the stuff that they didn't do so well at straight away as soon as they get into the car and the journey home? It's a 45-minute journey home or half-hour journey home. If that's what you choose to do, it's probably not going to be a fun experience for your daughter or your son. And if you do that repeatedly, they're probably not going to want to continue to play soccer or football, right? So it's important, I think, to start with the positive. Start with, here are the things that you did well, and rather than going into the negative, let that sit for a while, and then ask them, well, how do you think you did? And let them come out with where they didn't do so well, because they'll know it. And when they do, you're not sort of diving in and saying, "Yeah, I agree, that was crap." You're saying, "Well, why do you think that was? What might you have done differently?" And all of a sudden, it's a completely different conversation that starts with the positive. And rather than telling people what to do, you're asking questions. And I think that makes a huge difference in that relationship that you have with individuals, that you have with that individual, and individuals will have with each other. I think language and words matter. I've been in so many meetings where I see people come in and make a presentation or to each other or to their leader, and the leader responds with, "Well, I can't believe you said that, because that bloody blah place where I used to be at, we did whatever." And immediately, that person that's presenting is thinking, "Well, why did you ask me to present if you had the answers to begin with?" Or someone will say, "Well, I'm very concerned with what you just presented," or "I'm very surprised," or "What were you thinking?" And all those kinds of words, I think, are discouraging for people. I think they destroy trust because you're not sure why you were brought in the first place. It lowers confidence. And I think it ultimately disempowers. I think that makes a difference. When you talk about trust, I think it's important. This is a lesson that I think everyone's parent and grandparent probably told me or told you, which is to give before you get. So extend, regardless of whether you're going to get. I want people to trust me. I want people to appreciate me and to value me, but I can't make anybody do anything. What I can do is I can extend trust. I can show appreciation, and I can help try and make people feel valued. I can do things to help people feel valued. And I think in that kind of environment, the more you're doing that and others are doing that, the more it's reciprocated. I think that give before you get, I think, is a really important part of a functioning team and an important part of leadership. Um, I think that in this the conversation about trust, it's important to be who you are. It's important to bring your whole self to the conversation. I think people hold themselves back, and when they do, I think they lose the opportunity for other people to get to know who you really are. And I think when people do get to know, as long as you're not a serial, killer, people get to know who you are, people generally speaking, I think people appreciate and like that, and they reciprocate. I go back to my wife when I first met her 20 plus years ago. She was incredibly open about herself, her feelings, and people responded by sharing of themselves and their feelings. And that can lead to an environment that's sort of vulnerable for people, because you're sharing people about what's important to you and what isn't, and what you might be struggling with. But it goes a heck of a long way in building trust within a team.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've used a word there, and you've used it more than once, that I think's just so important, and that is vulnerable. And so many people, I think, in work are very nervous about being vulnerable. They think somebody's going to kick them in the butt. And the sad thing is that sometimes that may be what happens. And I think it's also a case of making the conscious choice about who and how you want to be. There's something that really interesting. There's a couple of things actually, Badar, I'd like to share. One is very early on in my career, I really got asked, not asked, I got given an opportunity to make a choice about whether to be authentic or not. And I was asked to go and do a speaking engagement, and it was to a lot of, I think, mainly IT people, about 80% men, not a lot of people, but I don't know, 100, 150, something like that. And they wanted me to talk about responsibility. Now, you've heard me talk about responsibility, and you know that I share where I learnt it, how I screwed up, how often. So I share deeply personal things about me. And I did this on stage, and you could see some of the people going, "Oh, wow, amazing." Some people going, "Oh, God, too much information. Don't need all that." So you could see every extreme. And the feedback I got afterwards was exactly, it was one extreme to the other. Too personal, didn't need all that stuff, and so on. And I thought about it for about a month, probably. And I know not many consultants would probably share quite as openly as I do about me and or my screw ups, if you like. And I thought about it for about a month, and I thought, okay, this could bite me in the bum fairly often. Quite a lot of people may say they don't want a consultant to do that. And I really had to think about, am I going to be more the sort of consultant that tells people what to do, but without telling them who I really am? And I made the decision, and it was a very conscious one. No, it's more important to me to be authentic.
Yeah.
It's more important to be who I am, accepting that some people who won't want to work with me, they won't like it, they won't be comfortable, but that's okay. And I do think at times that making that choice can be a choice where you need to have some guts and say, am I going to choose to do that? Am I going to choose to hold on? I don't know what your thoughts are about that, or if you've had any times where it has bitten you in the bum.
For sure. Well, no, I don't think actually it has. There have been times where it's come back to bite me. I mean, I do agree with you though that it's not easy. It's not easy to share, to share everything about yourself. It's not easy to reveal everything that there is to be revealed, or a lot that you might want to reveal. I think because you are making yourself vulnerable. Uh, but I think that when you do that, people, in my experience, generally appreciate that, and they respond. And when they respond, I think that's when you have that trust factor, growing. And I think it's an incredibly important part of a team. I think that trust, that vulnerability, an environment where people, you know, realize that they're sharing these things about themselves that are making themselves potentially look weak, I think is a really important part of trust. And it makes a team go a heck of a long way. I think that, and actually having a common purpose. I think a common purpose in the team is also really important. And some sense that my role is important to whatever we're, jointly trying to achieve, and what we're jointly trying to achieve is appreciated by everyone. I think those are the two things that make a difference in the team.
I mean, I do, and there's something else that you said, where I love the way you were talking about the football and the conversation in the car on the way home. And I think that one of the things that you are unquestionably very, very skilled at is questioning. Now, I don't know if you ever know this, but I came out, and it was on one of the weeks when I was coming out to work with you and your team in Houston. And I met somebody on the aeroplane from BP, and he was chatting. And on the way, he said he contacted me after I'd arrived and said, "Look, I'd really like to have a further conversation with you. Have you got any time?" And I said, "Well, the only time I've got is about an hour." And it was at the hotel where I was working with you and your team. So he came to meet me, and we had the conversation. And then I said, "Why did you choose to come here?" And he said, "Well, I've moved all my appraisal, and I was doing appraisal here today. So my team are coming here to meet me. I took a room here." So I said, "Okay. So just tell me, how do you approach it?" And he said, "For me, this is really, really important." He said, "I know a lot of people don't treat it as important. I do. And I spend a lot of time thinking about the individual, what they've done well in the year, where they need to improve, and so on." And I said, "Oh, it's great to hear you take so much effort. So tell me, how do you approach it?" He said, "Well, always I start off with telling them what I think they've done really well before we go on to anything else." So I said, "Oh, that's great." So I said, "Tell me, why do you do that?" He said, "I think the good news is important first." I said, "No, no. Why do you tell them what you think they've done well?" He said, "Because I want them to know how much I care." So I said, "Yes, but hang on a minute. Who's taking responsibility here?" I said, "Why don't you consider starting off by asking them, what do they think they've done well?" And most people don't really like blowing their own trumpets too much. There'll probably be a few things they don't miss that they don't share that you've thought of. So you can then build on it and say, "Yeah, I agree with you, but actually there's a couple of other things." And you can share those as well. So they know you put the effort in. And I said, then you can go on to saying, "Where do you think you've got areas for improvement?" Because what you're doing is asking them to think it, and they'll probably come up with even more than you've thought of. And you can say, "Well, actually, I don't think that was as bad as you think it was," and so on. And then you can ask them, "Okay, so how do you think that you could go about building on this? How do you think that you might step forward to be able to develop in this area?" I said, "Because at the end of the day, however good it is, if you share with them first before asking them to think, you are taking responsibility, not them." And it
Totally.
was really interesting, Badar, because he phoned me just as I got on the plane going back, saying, "Oh my God, it's the best day I've ever had." And it's such a small difference. But that's where you're so good. What are your thoughts about that?
Couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. I think I I think I heard your story about ownership, 15 to 20 years ago, and took it to heart. All performance reviews should go that way. You should always be asking people, how do you think you performed over the course of the year? Um, and allow them to talk about what they think they did well, what they think they could have done differently. And I think that's the way every performance reviews that I've been doing for at least 15 years now. But it's actually not just, I mean, I know it's not just in the performance reviews, it's actually on a day-to-day basis. As a leader, people are going to come to you and say, "Badar or Penny, what should I do?" And again, I think you care about people, you want them to succeed, and so you give you it's easier to say, "Well, here's what I think you should do, Penny. Here's what I think you should do." And that there are times where that is important and that is required, but I'd say that more often it's better for you to say, "Well, what do you think you should do? What do you and why? And how would you do that?" And just a series of questions where you're not actually answering the question that they asked you in the first place. And by doing that, they own the solution. They own whatever it is they're going to do. You don't own it because you didn't tell them what to do. And if they have a setback, which everyone has setbacks, they're not going to blame you because it wasn't your idea. They're going to own it for themselves because they owned it from the get-go, and they maybe work harder or come back to you for advice, but throughout that whole time they've owned it. I think when we talked about how tough it can be for a CEO, that's an example where it's your you may it may be easier to say, well, just do this. And again, there are times where it's important to do that, but more often it's better, harder and better to say, what do you think, and ensure that ownership stays with the individual. I think that's an incredibly important part of actually leadership behaviors.
Yeah, and you said something there. I think if they've owned it, they work harder to make it work. If you give them the instruction, it's very easy to say, "Oh well, what you told me to do wasn't going to work because." Whereas if they've come up with it, they'll find creative ways around whatever the problem emerges is.
Yeah.
Um, they work harder at it, I believe. Absolutely. So, Badar, I want to share with you a quote, and then, in fact, there's two quotes. One I'm going to share, you don't need to comment on because you've been saying this all the way through. And it's a wonderful quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson. To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment. And I think that's what you've been saying all the way through. It's about having the courage to be you, who you are, bringing all of you to work, not just a part of you, but all of you, and being prepared to be open and vulnerable. But this other one, I really want to know how you would respond to this. And it was one by Norman Schwarzkopf. Leadership is a potent combination of strategy and character. But if you must be without one, be without the strategy. Tell me what you think about that.
I completely agree. Um, I think that if I look back at the teams that I've led over the years or been a part of over the years, when we've had, setback after setback, it's usually got nothing to do with strategy. It's got everything to do with issues around, lack of trust or lack of trust within the team. It'll have issues around respect or pride that might exist, or personal ambition that might be in the team. All these sorts of things that the team never really cleared, and they get in the way of people working with each other, when supporting each other, spotting things for each other, catching each other when things go wrong. I think when you've got all of those things working and you do have a bad strategy, it'll be very easy for the team to say, okay, we figured out we are going in the wrong direction, because they'll spot it for each other, and they'll support each other in changing direction, and no one's going to blame each other. But I think that when you don't have those things working, it doesn't matter how good your strategy is, because people will not, they won't work well together. And so the strategy just won't get executed well. So I think that character, or, culture, I think is another way of saying it. And I think the expression that we've all probably heard is culture eats strategy for breakfast. I think that's completely true. I'll actually tell you another story. I was at Direct Energy, which is the US division of Centrica. I was there for 14 years. This is a business that grew, in that 14 years from about I think 15-fold, something like that, over in revenue terms, from a few hundred people to over 6,000 people, over 20 M&A transactions. I joined that team at the sort of senior to mid-level, and excuse me, became CEO. When I left, I had lots of folks saying, sending me messages, farewell messages, voicemails, emails, toasts, what have you. And I thought people would talk about the things that we accomplished together at some point in those 14 years. We grew from $1 billion to 15 billion in revenue. We did all of these deals together. And I think to a ratio of like 20-1, people weren't talking about any of that stuff. No one was talking about strategy or whatever deal we did. Almost everybody was talking about how they felt being part of that team that I was a part of. how they felt about the culture that we had created together. And that to me was it was nice to hear, but it was really interesting that people weren't talking about strategy or they weren't talking about all these projects, but they were talking about feelings and the environment that we created that made people feel good. And we were succeeding. We were doing great. So I think that's another example of character or culture trumping strategy.
Yeah, I think it's a great one too. Right, I'm going to bowl you a bit of a googly now. Um, if you can think back over your times, because you now have um, a way of behaving that everybody, I think, there's so many messages coming up. Everybody would like to work for you again, would like to follow you wherever you go. What advice might you give to somebody, and from your experience of life, if they have a really bad manager, not a leader, but a manager who is not good? What advice could you give to help them?
Yeah. Well, first that sucks. I think that does need to be said. That's not great. That's not fun. That's not going to be a good environment to begin with. I would say that it's important to stay, to stay focused on trying to be the best leader that you can be. So if you subscribe to what we've been talking about the last 45 minutes or so, stay true to that. Stay true to those leadership behaviors, because I think that all of these things that we've talked about they're good for all seasons. They're good for you at home. They're good for you at work. They're good for you at home. They're good for you in your relationships with your spouse, with your parents, with your children, with your friends. These are things that will make you a happier person. And so stay true to that. I believe, and maybe, I don't think I'm naive, but, I believe that at work, that will over time result in better outcomes. Hopefully, people around you, your peers, will notice and will respond with like behaviors, and that'll make that team environment without the manager above you a better workplace. And I think that even bad leaders or bad managers will notice those things, because when those things do exist, as we said before, teams work better. They might take a bad strategy or a good strategy and make a bad strategy good and a good strategy even better. So I think even bad leaders may notice. I think that if that isn't working, or if that's not working enough for you, seek out leaders in the organization that you do respect, that you do value, that you do appreciate, and maybe see if you could build relationships with them. See if you might get the ability, if you're a less senior person, be able to be transferred to a different part of the company, or to get mentorship from another leader, or maybe by being a little bit open about what you're experiencing, other better leaders may see what you're seeing and choose to take some action. And if none of those things work, Penny, I think then maybe it is time to think about, if you can, finding another place to work.
Yeah, we do come across too many people who are not particularly happy, but they can't see a way out because of the finances. And so they stay even though they're miserable, but they really don't know how to deal with it. And I think that where you're talking about almost the networking of beginning to find leaders that you do rate. I think also to remember that even if you do have a boss who's really not a good one, you can look at it and say, what can I learn from this? Even if it's learning what not to do, it may be learning how you handle things in a different way. And I think some of the skills that you probably need more than anything else is learning how to ask good questions of the boss. So when they start doing unreasonable things, rather than getting frustrated, being able to ask a question in a way, okay, if you knew that may not work as well as this approach, how would you feel about that? Or finding a way to
Yes.
ask questions, because I think when people have a bad boss, they're either apt to close down or they're apt to get very confrontational.
Yeah.
That probably doesn't help too much. So tell me about it. As a CEO, what do you think are the most difficult things that you've ever had to deal with? things that you think, oh God, I really don't want to have to deal with this?
They're always people decisions. Uh, I think that they're the hardest decisions. So, when we talked about strategy, yeah, it's important that you have a strategy, you have a direction, but at the end of the day, lots of things may change, and you may change course, and that is inevitable. I think decisions around people are the hardest decisions. So, um, is someone working out, on the team? Maybe someone's exhibiting behaviors that are completely contrary to ours. How do you handle that? Those have been the hardest decisions, I think. Um, Decisions around, giving people, it's important to take risk, actually, because I think when you take a risk, you make mistakes and you learn from them. It's important to allow people to. Might sound crazy, but it's important to allow people to fail a little bit, and it's the same point about being a parent. You don't do your exams for your pet for your kids, and that's hard. Watching people sort of fall down is not easy, but I think as a leader, it's important that you let people fall down. You need to let people scratch their knees. You don't want them to get their legs amputated when they fall down. But I think that's a large part of what leadership is: creating an environment where people are pushing themselves, they are taking a risk, knowing that they may fall down, and as a leader, knowing and help ensuring that if they do fall down, they're not getting their legs amputated, but in fact they're able to pick themselves up and help them to do that. I think all of those things are not easy; they are tough, and all of these things are people decisions.
Yeah, and I'd be curious to know, how do you handle it if you're in an organization and you've got somebody on your team who is absolutely delivering the results? They are delivering the results, but absolutely countercultural. They don't do it in a leadership style. They do it very much in a management style. So they're driving performance all the time, driving people underneath them, but they are delivering results. How do you handle that?
Well, I think it's important first to set expectations. So if you haven't already set an expectation of what you expect in terms of leadership behaviors, it's important that you do that first, and do that clearly, with the individual and with everybody on the team. I believe, and I think I've tried to do this in my time. It's important. I think it's then important to try and coach folks. So set an expectation that beyond sort of business or commercial performance, there's a set of leadership behaviors are more important. Try to coach people towards them, but I don't think you want to do that forever. You have to have some kind of time set for that. And if people are not able to or not willing to, whichever, to shift their leadership behaviors, it's then very important that those people are removed from their roles. I think that if you don't do that, you end up undermining everything that you're talking about in terms of leadership behaviors and leadership, and culture, and values in the organization. You just undermine all of that, and it all just goes away, and you lack credibility.
Yeah, I do think you're right. And of course, if you have somebody who is, even if they're delivering results, you can be 100% certain that they're holding back the potential of the people underneath them. And of course, that is really not helpful at all. So, Badar, what I'd really like you to do is think about your role as a leader. And if you had to summarize for everybody who's listening here, you had to summarize what you think are the key skills and behaviors that you need to be a great leader, what would they be?
Well, I think, let me summarize and say what I think leadership is. What leaders do, I think leaders help people become, and do more than they thought possible themselves. So they help people become and be and do more than those individuals thought possible. And I think they do that by building confidence. They build confidence individually, one-on-one with individuals, and they build confidence in an organization. And they do that by all the things that we've just talked about. They build trust, they listen, they accentuate the positive, they encourage ownership, they encourage an environment where people are taking risk, so that they can learn, so that when they take risks, they may make mistakes, but they can learn from that. Um, they they have a level of self-awareness that we talked about, that allows them to see their behaviors when they're operating in the moment. They're authentic, they're vulnerable, and again, that creates the conditions where people have trust. I think those are the kind of things that I would say are what matters in terms of leadership behaviors.
And tell me, you're going into a role now where a lot of it's virtual. Tell me, what do you think are the extra challenges? Because a lot of people, I think, are struggling with this. What do you think are the extra challenges that you may need to deal with because so much is virtual?
Again, I go back to the example of my nephew when he did that work shadow with me. When you're in that virtual environment, it's harder to see the sort of whole body sort of experience. And so when you're talking to folks, you have this window. I'm on a Zoom and I see them for 45 minutes or an hour, and then they go away, and I actually don't know what's happening. And
Yeah.
I think so. I don't know what kind of impact they're having. I don't know what they're experiencing, what they're feeling in a virtual environment. So I think that's harder to be able to build an environment where, as a leader, you've got a sense for how people are feeling. I think that makes it so much harder. I think people get tired with this Zoom sort of
Yeah.
stuff,
Yeah.
clearly, and I think you've got to find ways to do other things beyond just Zoom interactions in a virtual environment. It's important to bring people together every now and then. It's important that when people are coming together, they're not just sitting in a room listening to stuff, because I could do that at home. I can watch TV and listen and view stuff. I think when you're in an environment, when you do bring people together, it's important that when physically together, I think it's important that those moments you make the most of those moments. So they're higher emotional value. They're meaningful moments for people at an emotional level. Whether you're talking about things like vulnerability or trust or common purpose, I think it's important to make sure that happens when you do bring people together, when you're otherwise working in a remote environment.
Yeah. You said again something there. You talked about common purpose. It's so fascinating to me that so often companies have a set of values and they have a strategy and they have a vision, but they're not very clear about their purpose. And I think getting the purpose is so important. How easy do you find that?
I think that purpose is. Um, I think for some organizations that I've been a part of over the last 20 years, it's been easier. Actually, the company that I'm joining has got a very strong sense of mission and purpose. We're trying to reduce emissions across the planet, by enabling the electrification of vehicles. Um, I think for other organizations, it's a little harder, because it's not so clear. But I think it's important that leaders, as you just said, take the time to think about what is it that we're doing that goes beyond what we're doing on a day-to-day basis, but we're still contributing to. And I think that is a journey that it's important that you go through, not just sort of you don't bring in I don't know, like an advertising or a PR, like an external firm to do that for you, but you go through that journey with yourself and with your people together. And it's a journey of discovery that sometimes can take a while, but it's always worth it.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I'd be interested to know when you're endeavoring to find the purpose, because for me personally, this may not be true for you. I think the purpose is the thing that gets you out of bed every morning and inspires you to work more than the vision, more than anything else. I'm here to save lives, or I'm here to put in the best care possible for people who are not so well off, or I'm here, whatever it happens to be. um, I'm here to reduce emissions, or however it is, whatever it is that really makes people say, I'm contributing to making a difference, either to individual lives or the world or whatever. And I think that's what gets you out of bed in the morning. When you begin to start the journey of finding the purpose, how far down the organization do you go to see if you can find out what people's thoughts and ideas are without ending up with so many that you think, God, where the hell are we?
Yeah, if you're leading an organization with 20,000 people, you can't go to 20,000. It's hard to get to 20,000 people. So that's not practical, but it's also not, it's important that it's not just with yourself or with your top team. I think it's important to find individuals that are culture carriers across your organization and to bring them into this conversation. And that will require you to go deep. I think as much as possible, you want to try and avoid hierarchy in this sort of thing. So it's not like a level by level thing, but it's people that have that are connectors and culture carriers at any level of an organization. Can I just say just one thing about getting out of bed in the morning, jumping out of bed in the morning? I have seen that you can work an 80-hour week and be energized and happy. I've also seen and experienced doing a 20-hour week and be miserable and unhappy and unengaged, right? So that's to your point. And in my mind, that comes from three things. Purpose is one, I think, and it may be the most important, but in my mind, it's one of three. I think the other two are working with people that you enjoy working with. And that's got some of that has got to do with the people that you work with, but a lot of it has to do with what you choose to do. And it goes back to what we were saying earlier, do I choose to bring my whole self? When I do that to work, I've found and I believe that others will reciprocate and do more of the same, and you will like who you work with. When you know more about people, about their feelings, desires, vulnerabilities, you will tend to be drawn to them and to like them, and it'll make it a more enjoyable environment. And I think that's number two. And I think the third thing is just feeling appreciated. Everybody wants to feel appreciated. And I think that, again, that starts with you. When you appreciate what is in front of you, when you appreciate what you have and appreciate others, people over time will respond. And you have an environment where people are appreciating and valuing and supporting each other. And I think when those three things exist, purpose, enjoying who you work with, and feeling valued and appreciated, I would jump out of bed and go to work. And when I don't have those things, again, it's not for somebody else to make me feel appreciated. It's not for somebody else to make me feel happy. It's not for someone else to help me figure out what am I doing, what my purpose is. It's for me to figure those things out. And if I still can't figure those things out, then maybe it's time to go somewhere else.
And it's interesting because one of the things as a CEO that often doesn't happen is the CEO doesn't get appreciated. People know that they need to do it to downwards, as it were, and they need to appreciate their team, but they forget that they do it upwards. And so the CEO is quite often the one who gets the least. Although I'd have to say, in these instances, I cannot tell you, I've been endeavoring to see if I can see some of the messages that have come up. The appreciation for you and who you are just comes from everywhere. I don't think we've ever had so many comments come up when I've done a conversation. They've come up, you are valued so much by so many. And I'd like to say a huge thank you, and not just from everybody here, but from me. You've been the most amazing client to work with. You're an incredible friend. I value in my life. It is the richer for having you in it. You've supported and been amazing to me and to Emma. And I just want to thank you for being here and for being the very special person you are. Thank
Well,
you.
thank you, Penny. And I appreciate what you've done for me over the years in terms of helping me become a better leader. I've been on I've been on your program, Penny, for I don't know how many times. But with each team, I've had the opportunity to be a part of and to lead, and it's been a better experience every time.
Thank you, Badar.
Thank you.